The light in my office was always the color of old whiskey, a deep amber that spilled over the polished mahogany of my desk and caught in the crystal of the decanter I never touched before sundown. For 40 years, that light had been the silent witness to my reign, the unchanging backdrop to the shifting allegiances and whispered fears that constituted my world. I was Lorenzo Costello, a name that was its own form of currency, its own law. It tasted of respect and smoke and the metallic tang of fear. My power was a tangible thing, a weight in the air of any room I entered, a force that bent the wills of lesser men. I had built an empire on unspoken rules and brutal certainties, a fortress of loyalty and tradition that I believed to be impregnable. The old ways were the best ways, I always said. Blood and iron. A man's word. These were the foundations. I saw the world in clean, simple lines of strength and weakness, loyalty and betrayal. I was the architect of it all, the lion on the mountain, and I had forgotten what it was to be anything else. Then came the morning the light changed. It wasn't the sun, which still streamed through the bulletproof glass with its usual indifferent warmth. It was the glow from the dozen screens that lined the wall, the screens that were my eyes and ears on the city. They flickered, one by one, from the cool blue of financial data and security feeds to a jarring, insolent red. On each screen, a single symbol bloomed like a drop of blood in water, a black circle with a white zero at its heart. Zero Syndicate, the news would later call them. To me, they were ghosts, digital wraiths, who had slipped through the stone walls of my fortress as if they were mist. The numbers vanished first. The accounts, scattered across the globe under names and corporations that were themselves ghosts, simply ceased to exist. They didn't read zero. They were just gone. An abyss had opened in the heart of my financial empire, and everything had fallen in. Then came the information, the ledgers I kept only in my head, the secrets whispered in this very office, the silent agreements sealed with a handshake. They were all laid bare, spilled across the internet like so much trash on the street. My network of influence, so carefully woven over decades, was shredded in moments. Calls began to flood the lines, not with whispers of support, but with the shrill panic of rats on a sinking ship. Politicians, judges, union bosses, men who had eaten at my table, were suddenly strangers with no memory of my name. The final, most intimate violation was the silence from my own. Marco, my underboss, my protégé, the son I never had, came into the office. He did not look at me. He looked at the screens, a strange, tight smile on his lips. He said the other capos were waiting. They wanted a meeting. Without me. He didn't have to say the words. I saw it in his eyes, the cold, reptilian flicker of opportunity. The lion was wounded and the jackals were gathering. He called me Lorenzo, not Don Costello, not Sir. Just my name, stripped of all its power, naked and useless. That was the true catalyst. It wasn't the loss of the money or the exposure of my secrets. It was the casual, public shearing away of my identity. In that moment, in my own amber-lit office, I became a ghost to myself. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. The lion inside me, the one that had roared for 40 years, was silent. I simply nodded. I walked out of that office, past the men who would not meet my eyes, and into a world that no longer recognized my authority. The jeers and laughter I heard behind me were not loud, but they echoed in the sudden vast emptiness of my life. I didn't cry. I just kept walking until the familiar city skyline looked like the shore of a foreign country. My world hadn't just crumbled, it had been erased. And I, Lorenzo Costello, was left standing in the ruins of a man I used to be, a public spectacle of humiliation, a king with no kingdom, a name with no meaning. The silence that followed was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all the familiar sounds of my life. The purr of a limousine engine, the deferential murmur of a doorman, the constant low hum of a city that paid me tribute. All of it was gone, replaced by the indifferent drone of traffic and the hollow echo of my own footsteps on unfamiliar pavement. I found refuge in a small, forgotten apartment my father had kept, a place so far off the grid even I had barely remembered its existence. It smelled of dust and disuse, a museum of a life before power. The furniture was shrouded in white sheets, pale ghosts in the dim light. For days, I did nothing. I sat in the dark and let the weight of my new reality press down on me. I replayed the moment of my fall over and over, not with anger, but with a kind of detached clinical curiosity. The red screens, Marco's smirk, the averted eyes of men who had sworn loyalty on their mothers' graves. It was a lesson in the physics of power. A force is only a force until it meets an immovable object, or, in my case, an intangible one. My kingdom of iron and blood had been undone by whispers in a wire, by children playing with keyboards in a dark room somewhere on the other side of the world. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison, not hot like rage, but cold, seeping into my bones, leaving me brittle. I thought of my wife, Maria, long gone. She had always seen the cracks in my fortress. "Your power, Lorenzo," she used to say, her voice soft as velvet, "is a beautiful, heavy crown. But you are holding it up with your own two hands. What happens when you get tired?" I was tired. I was more than tired. I was hollowed out. One evening, the gnawing emptiness in my stomach became a literal hunger. I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I found a crumpled $20 bill in the pocket of an old coat hanging in the closet and a pizza flyer stuffed under the door. The irony was not lost on me. A man who once bought restaurants on a whim was now counting change for a pepperoni pizza. I made the call. A young, disinterested voice on the other end took my order. An hour later, there was a soft knock. I opened the door to a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. She wore a faded blue cap, a smudge of flour on her cheek, and headphones around her neck leaking a tinny, frantic beat. She held out the pizza box, her eyes fixed on her phone. 15.50, she mumbled. I gave her the 20. "Keep the change," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. As she turned to leave, her gaze drifted past me into the apartment and snagged on something. On a small table by the door sat an old, heavy laptop, a relic from a decade ago that I had brought with me out of some forgotten instinct. It was closed, covered in a fine layer of dust. "That's a Kestrel 3, she said, her voice suddenly clear, interested. "They stopped making those years ago. The motherboard on them was a work of art. Flawed, but beautiful." I just stared at her. I had no idea what she was talking about. I just knew it was a computer. "It's old," I managed. She nodded, her eyes still on the machine. "Old things can still be useful." Then she shrugged, the moment of connection broken, and walked away. The pizza tasted like cardboard, but it was something to do. A ritual of normalcy in a life that had become anything but. The girl's words echoed in my head. Old things can still be useful. Was I an old thing? Was I still useful? The next night, driven by the same primal hunger, I ordered again. The same girl arrived. This time, she looked at me, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "You again," she said, not unkindly. As I paid her, she glanced again at the dusty laptop. "You ever turn it on?" I shook my head. "The password is lost, like everything else." She hesitated for a moment, a silent debate playing out on her face. Then she pulled a pen from her pocket, and scribbled something on a napkin from the dispenser on her belt. She pushed it into my hand. That's the factory boot key command for a Kestrel 3. It'll bypass the password prompt. Just don't connect it to the internet. The security on it is a sieve. And then she was gone. I looked down at the napkin. It was a string of letters and symbols, a language I didn't understand. It was nothing. A scribble from a pizza girl. But it was also the first piece of advice, the first offer of help, however small, that I had received since my world ended. A key. That night, sitting in the ghostly silence of the apartment, I made a decision. It wasn't a grand, cinematic resolution. It was a quiet, internal shift, a flicker of some long-dormant instinct. I had spent my life demanding loyalty and buying expertise. Now, stripped of everything, I was being offered a piece of knowledge for free on a greasy napkin. I had nothing left to lose. I took the sheet off an old armchair, wiped the dust from the Kestrel 3, and for the first time in my life, I decided to place my trust in a complete and utter stranger. I decided to try the key. The flashbacks came unbidden, slivers of memory cutting through the gray monotony of my new existence. I remembered my father, his hands thick and calloused from the docks, holding my face and telling me that a man is only as good as his word and the strength in his back. He believed in a world you could touch, a world of concrete and steel. He'd have spat on the very idea of an enemy you couldn't see, a threat that existed only as light and electricity. He built his legacy with his fists. I built mine with fear and favor, but it was still a physical thing, a network of bodies in rooms, of money in vaults, of influence exerted through a handshake or a hard stare. My lieutenants were men like me, men who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of power. Marco Bellini, especially. I found him as a kid, all raw ambition and street corner swagger. I saw the hunger in him, the same hunger I'd had. I molded him. I taught him how to dress, how to speak, how to command a room with silence. I gave him the keys to a kingdom he could never have built himself. I remembered a dinner, years ago, at a restaurant I owned. The table was laden with food. Wine flowed freely. Marco was telling a story, charming everyone. He turned to me and raised his glass. To Don Costello, he'd boomed, his voice full of performative reverence. The man who taught me that tradition is the foundation of everything. The old ways are the only ways. Everyone applauded. I just nodded, accepting the tribute. But even then, a small, cold part of me noted the word he used, tradition. He said it like it was something to be admired in a museum, an artifact from a bygone era. He was honoring my past, not my future. He and the others, the younger ones, they had started to talk about things I didn't understand. Encryption, data mining, cryptocurrency. To me, it sounded like a foreign language, the babble of children obsessed with their glowing toys. I dismissed it. My power was real, rooted in the earth. Theirs was a fantasy, a flicker on a screen. I saw now that my dismissal was not strength, but a profound and fatal arrogance. I had become the thing I despised most, a relic, blind to the changing shape of the world. While I was polishing the cannons on my fortress walls, the enemy had already tunneled underneath, and my own soldiers were leaving the gates open for them. This was the history of their entitlement. I had given them so much, made them so comfortable in the world I had built, that they had forgotten the struggle, the blood and sacrifice that had laid the foundation. They saw me not as the architect, but as the aging groundskeeper, a necessary but increasingly irrelevant part of the scenery. They took my protection for granted, enjoyed the fruits of my reputation, and all the while, they were quietly resenting the shadow I cast. My neglect was not of them, but of their world, the new world they were so eager to embrace. I had failed to see that their ambition was not a mirror of my own, but a distorted reflection. I wanted to build something that would last. They just wanted to inherit the throne. This history played out in my mind as I sat before the old laptop, the greasy napkin with its cryptic instructions sitting beside it. I saw their faces smiling, toasting my name while already imagining a world without me. And in that moment, the cold humiliation began to burn, to transmute into something else. It was a quiet, simmering anger, not at the faceless hackers of Zero Syndicate, but at the boys I had raised, the vipers I had warmed at my own hearth. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had dismissed me. They had looked at Lorenzo Costello and seen nothing more than an old thing, no longer useful. The pizza girl's words came back to me, an ironic echo. With trembling hands, I plugged in the old laptop. The screen flickered to life with a low hum, a ghost stirring from its slumber. I held down the keys she had written down, my thick fingers clumsy on the plastic. A black screen appeared, filled with white text, a language as alien to me as the surface of the moon. It was the world of my enemies, the world of my treacherous sons. And for the first time, I was looking at it from the inside. A profound internal shift had taken place. The decision to trust the girl with the blue cap was not just about getting past a password. It was about admitting that my world, my rules, my entire philosophy of strength was obsolete. I was a student again, in a school I didn't understand, with a teacher who didn't even know she was teaching. The third time she came, I was ready. I had the money in my hand, but I didn't order a pizza. I had called the shop and asked for her by name. Alessia, the manager had said, sighing as if the request were an inconvenience. When I opened the door, she looked confused, her hands empty. I didn't get an order for this address, she said, her guard up. I stepped back and gestured inside. This isn't about pizza. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing. I understood. In her world, a girl doesn't walk into a strange man's apartment. I won't hurt you, I said, my voice raspy from disuse. I just want to talk. About computers. The corner of her mouth twitched, a flicker of a smile. You got the old Kestrel working then? I nodded, gesturing to the table where the laptop sat, its screen now glowing with a simple, empty desktop. I did, but I don't know what to do with it. She stepped inside, cautiously, leaving the door ajar. She walked over to the laptop and touched the trackpad, her fingers moving with an unconscious grace. She was a musician, and this was her instrument. What do you want to do with it? She asked, her eyes on the screen. I want to find the people who did this to me, I said. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all I had lost. I want to understand how they did it. She looked at me then, truly looked at me, for the first time. Her gaze was unnervingly direct, devoid of the fear or deference I was accustomed to. It was the look of a pure analyst. She was assessing me, not as a man, but as a problem, a set of variables. They're called Zero Syndicate, she said, her tone matter of fact. They're a decentralized collective. Very skilled. They made you a ghost. I flinched at the word, the same one I had used for myself. How do you know that? She shrugged. It's my world. I read the traffic. I follow the code. They were proud of this job. They bragged. This was the beginning of our strange alliance. Her name was Alessia. She delivered pizzas to pay for her servers and the rent on a tiny apartment she shared with two other people. She was a digital native, a creature of the web, fluent in a dozen coding languages. She was also a ghost herself, a nobody in the physical world, a girl who smeared flour on her cheek and was invisible to men like me. She agreed to help, not for money, I had none to offer her yet, but for the challenge. She called it The ultimate puzzle box. Our reclamation of power was not a single dramatic act, but a slow, methodical campaign waged from a dusty apartment. It began with information. I was her historian. She was my translator. I told her everything I knew about my organization, my finances, my enemies, my allies. I spoke of accounts, names, locations, habits. It was a torrent of information from the analog world. She sat in the dark, her face illuminated by the glow of the kestrel's screen, and listened. Her fingers would fly across the keyboard, not typing words, but weaving the threads of my spoken history into patterns I couldn't comprehend. She was building a map, not of the city, but of my life, charting its digital ghost. The process was painstaking. She taught me the basics of digital security, of how to move without leaving footprints. We got burner phones. She had me go to a public library miles away to buy a new laptop, a specific model, paid for with cash. I felt like a spy in a cheap movie, a caricature of my former self. One of my first tasks was to procure a dozen of the most powerful graphics cards on the market. I had to use the last of my physical resources, calling in a favor from a pawnshop owner who still owed me his life, a man so old and out of the loop he didn't know I had fallen. Sal. He got them for me. No questions asked, his eyes full of a sad, knowing pity. When I brought the box back, Alessia's eyes lit up. She spent 2 days taking them apart and reassembling them, hooking them into the new laptop, creating a monstrous, whirring machine that filled the small apartment with a constant, low hum and an incredible amount of heat. "Now we have the horsepower," she murmured, more to the machine than to me. While she built her digital engine, my role was reduced to the mundane. I made her coffee, black, 4 sugars. I went out for groceries, my hat pulled down low, my face in the shadows. I was no longer the Don. I was the quartermaster, the caretaker. The role reversal was profound. I, who had never poured my own drink, was now her servant. And in this service, I found a strange, quiet dignity. I was contributing. I was part of a team, not as its commander, but as its foundation. I watched her work for hours, sometimes days on end. Her focus was absolute. The world outside the glowing screen ceased to exist for her. She was a warrior. Her battlefield a cascading wall of green and black text. She was hunting. She wasn't looking for Zero Syndicate directly. "You don't hunt a shark in the open ocean," she explained one night, her eyes red with exhaustion. "You follow the pilot fish, you watch the currents." She was tracing the digital currents, the faint ripples their attack had left on the global network. She found the back doors they'd used, the ghost accounts they'd funneled my money through. It was a breadcrumb trail made of electrons, and she was following it with a relentless, patient determination. Each small victory, each recovered piece of data, felt like reclaiming a single square inch of a lost continent. It was a slow, grueling process, a war of attrition fought in silence and darkness. The days bled into weeks, a quiet routine settling into the dusty apartment. The whir of the server rig Alessia had built became the new soundtrack to my life, a constant humming reminder of the silent war we were waging. During the day, she would often sleep, exhausted on the lumpy sofa, a blanket pulled over her head to block out the light. In those moments, I would sit in the old armchair and simply watch the cascading text on the monitor, the language of the enemy, of the new world. I began to see a strange beauty in it, a terrifying, intricate logic. It was a language of pure cause and effect, where a single misplaced comma could bring down an entire system. It was a world with its own brutal rules, not so different from mine, just faster, colder, and infinitely more vast. My education was slow, pieced together from her tired, late-night explanations. I learned about blockchain, about crypto wallets, about how a thing of value could exist without any physical form. I, who had measured wealth in stacks of cash and bars of gold, had to wrap my mind around the idea of a fortune that was nothing more than a long string of numbers on a decentralized ledger. It was humbling. It was like learning the world was round after a lifetime of believing it was flat. My flashbacks continued, but they began to change. I no longer just saw the moments of betrayal. I saw the signs I had missed, the thousand tiny ways my own arrogance had blinded me. I remembered Marco showing me a tablet once, excited about a new secure communication app. I had waved him away. "If you have something important to say, you say it to a man's face," I'd grumbled. I saw now that he wasn't just showing me a toy. He was trying to speak to me in the new language, and I had refused to listen. This growing self-awareness was more painful than the initial shock of my ruin. The hackers had taken my money and my power, but it was my own pride that had left me vulnerable, my own stubborn refusal to adapt that had signed my death warrant. I was an old lion who had grown fat and sleepy in the sun, forgetting that the jungle was always growing, always changing, producing new and deadlier predators. Alessia, in her quiet, relentless way, was my guide through this new jungle. She never judged my ignorance. She just stated facts. "This is a distributed denial of service attack," she'd say, pointing at a rapid-fire scroll of data. "They're using a botnet to overwhelm a server. It's brute force. Not elegant, but effective. Like using a battering ram when you can't find the key." She explained things in my terms, translating the digital into the physical. A firewall was a fortress wall. A virus was a poison. A hacker was a safecracker. Slowly, I began to understand the shape of our enemy. Zero Syndicate wasn't a traditional organization. They were a philosophy, a loose collection of brilliant, nihilistic minds who believed in chaos. They didn't want my money for themselves. They wanted to prove that money, that power like mine, was an illusion. They had evaporated my wealth not by stealing it, but by scattering it, atomizing it into a million different cryptocurrencies, and then deleting the keys, effectively burning it from existence. "They didn't rob the bank," Alessia clarified. "They burned the bank to the ground." This knowledge changed the nature of our fight. We were not trying to get my money back. We were hunting ghosts who had committed the perfect crime, a crime where the spoils themselves were destroyed. So what were we fighting for? For me, it had started as revenge. But sitting there in the humming darkness, watching this girl fight a war I couldn't comprehend, it turned into something else. It was about reclamation, not of wealth, but of a name, of dignity. It was about proving that the old lion, even without his teeth and claws, still had a mind. And he had found a new kind of strength, a new partner, a new weapon. A girl with a laptop who could see in the dark. Our first real breakthrough came in the 4th week. Alessia had been chasing a ghost in the machine, a piece of malicious code that Zero Syndicate had left behind. It was their signature, a calling card. Most hackers would have scrubbed their tracks clean, but Zero Syndicate was arrogant. They wanted the world to know who had toppled Lorenzo Costello. They had signed their work. Alessia had managed to isolate this piece of code and began to deconstruct it, line by line. It was like watching a bomb disposal expert at work. For 2 straight days, she didn't sleep. I kept a steady supply of coffee and sandwiches by her side, which she consumed without ever taking her eyes off the screen. I felt like a nurse in an operating theater, a helpless but necessary witness to a delicate life-or-death procedure. Then, in the dead of night, she sat back, her body slumping with exhaustion. "Got it," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "It's a worm. But it's got a flaw. A single, tiny vulnerability." She explained that the code was designed to communicate, to send a tiny data packet back to its creators to confirm a successful mission. It was a boast, a digital victory flag. "The signal is encrypted 1,000 times over," she said, a new energy in her voice. "It's designed to be untraceable, but it has to be sent from somewhere. And I know the protocol. I can build a trap. The next time any member of Zero Syndicate uses this code anywhere in the world, it will send a signal back to them and to us." It was a long shot. A fishing line dropped into the Pacific Ocean. We had no idea when or if another signal would be sent. It could be tomorrow. It could be never. Now, we had to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The frantic energy of the hunt was replaced by a tense, gnawing silence, broken only by the hum of the machines. During this lull, Alessia and I began to talk. Really talk. For the first time. Not about code or firewalls, but about our lives. I learned that her father had been a programmer, a brilliant man who had been cheated out of a revolutionary piece of software by a massive corporation. He fought them in court for years, but they buried him in legal fees. He lost everything and died a broken man. "He believed in the system," Alessia said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He thought the rules mattered. They don't. The only rule is whether you are the one writing the code or the one being written." In that moment, I understood her. Her fight wasn't just about the puzzle. It was about justice. Not the kind handed down by a judge in a black robe, but the kind you take for yourself. She was fighting the same war her father had lost, but on her own terms, in the shadows, where the corporate lawyers couldn't touch her. Her story resonated with the core of my own being. I had spent my life operating outside the system, creating my own rules, because I knew the official ones were a sham, designed to protect the powerful. We were from different worlds, a mafia don and a girl who delivered pizzas, but we were bound by the same fundamental truth. The world is not a fair place, so you have to make your own fairness. The irony was thick enough to choke on. I, who had built an empire on intimidation and violence, was now allied with a girl whose only weapon was her mind. I had always believed that power grew from the barrel of a gun. She was showing me that true power, the kind that could erase a man from existence, grew from the tip of a cursor. It was a profound and unsettling education. I started to see my past actions not as displays of strength, but as crude, clumsy failures of imagination. I had used a sledgehammer for a lifetime when what was needed was a scalpel. While we waited, the world outside continued on. The news cycle had moved on from my spectacular fall. I was old news, a forgotten headline. I learned from Sal, my one remaining contact, that Marco had taken my place. He was calling himself the new Dawn, but he was a puppet. The real power, the other families, the international cartels, they no longer trusted the old ways. They were moving their operations into the dark web, into the very world that Alessia inhabited. Marco was a figurehead, a manager of a decaying franchise. He was trying to steer a ship with a broken rudder, and he was too arrogant to even know it. One afternoon, a news report caught my eye. A major hospital in Chicago had its systems frozen by a ransomware attack. The hackers were demanding millions in cryptocurrency. At the bottom of the screen, for a fraction of a second, the news channel displayed the symbol the hackers had left on the hospital's screens. It was a black circle with a white zero. A ping echoed from Alessia's laptop. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but in the silence of that apartment, it was as loud as a cannon shot. Alessia, who had been dozing on the sofa, was on her feet in an instant, her eyes wide. She flew to the keyboard. "They used it," she breathed. "The arrogant bastards, they used the same worm." A map of the world appeared on the screen, a swirling mess of data streams. And then, a single pulsating red dot appeared. It was in a dense, urban area. Berlin. "That's the echo," Alessia said, her fingers a blur as she typed. That's the signal bouncing back. But it's not the source. The source is masked, routed through a dozen countries. So we've lost them? I asked, my heart sinking. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the first time I had ever seen her smile like that. It was the smile of a predator that has its prey cornered. They think the echo is just noise, a ghost. But they made one mistake. She brought up another window, a wall of pure code. They signed their work. And I have the key to their signature. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like the ones I had orchestrated in my past. There were no sit-downs in smoky back rooms, no threats veiled in polite language, no sudden, shocking acts of violence. The climax of our war was a quiet, relentless act of deconstruction, carried out by a girl in a faded hoodie, fueled by black coffee and a righteous fury. Alessia didn't attack Zero Syndicate's members directly. She didn't go after the red dot in Berlin. That was just a soldier. She went after their god. Their entire collective was built around a myth, the myth of anonymity. Their power came from the belief that they were untouchable ghosts, living in the deepest, darkest corners of the web. Alessia's plan was to turn on the lights. Using the vulnerability in their own signature code, she didn't just trace them, she burrowed into the very infrastructure of their network. She had the key, and she quietly unlocked every door. For 72 hours, she worked without a break. I watched, mesmerized, as she peeled back the layers of their digital onion. She moved with the silent, deadly grace of an assassin. She didn't crash their systems. She didn't steal their data. She simply copied it. She found their private forums, their chat logs, their real-world identities, which they had so carefully hidden behind layers of encryption. She found the personal files of the hacker in Berlin, a 22-year-old university student named Klaus. She found the leader, who went by the screen name Nix, a programmer from Toronto who worked a day job at a software company, a man who preached anarchy online while meticulously managing his retirement portfolio. She found them all. She compiled it all into a single encrypted file. She called it the Ghost File. Their greatest strength was their anonymity, she said, her eyes burning with a cold fire. Without it, they're just criminals. They're just loudmouthed kids and bitter middle-aged men with keyboards. The reveal was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, targeted strike. Alessia sent a single, untraceable email. The recipients were the top cybersecurity agencies in the world, the FBI, Interpol, MI6. The email contained no text, just the encrypted file and a single password to unlock it: Lorenzo Costello. The irony was a dish served ice cold. My name, the one they had dragged through the mud and rendered meaningless, was now the key to their complete and utter destruction. We watched the fallout online. Panic erupted on the dark web forums. The ghosts were screaming. They knew they had been exposed, but they didn't know how. Their network imploded in a matter of hours as members turned on each other, desperately trying to erase their tracks. Nix, the leader, wiped his servers, but it was too late. Klaus, the boy in Berlin, was arrested within a day. The myth of Zero Syndicate was shattered. They weren't gods. They were just men, and now they were afraid. In the aftermath, there was a strange quiet. The war was over. We had won. Alessia had given me back my name, and something more. She had located the fragmented remnants of my fortune, the digital dust that Zero Syndicate had scattered to the winds. With her skills, she could, she explained, begin the painstaking process of reassembling it. It wouldn't be all of it, not even half, but it would be more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the chance to reclaim my kingdom. I could feel the old instincts stirring, the hunger for power, for respect, for the amber-lit office and the fear in men's eyes. And then I looked at Alessia, asleep on the sofa, her face pale with exhaustion but peaceful. I looked at the whirring makeshift server that had been our engine room, our entire world. I looked at my own hands, no longer soft from a life of privilege, but calloused from carrying groceries and cleaning coffee pots. A memory surfaced, a flashback not of power, but of peace. A Sunday afternoon with Maria, years before my ascent, sitting in a small garden behind our first house. The sun was warm on my face. The smell of her roses filled the air. We weren't Don and Donna Costello. We were just Lorenzo and Maria. We were happy. That man, the one who could find happiness in a simple garden, had been buried for 40 years under the weight of a crown. My fall, my public humiliation, had been a kind of violent excavation, and this girl, this pizza girl, had unwittingly completed the dig. She had unearthed the man I used to be. The confrontation I had craved was not with Zero Syndicate. It was with Marco Bellini. He was the face of my betrayal, the symbol of the entitled, ungrateful family I had built. Sal arranged the meeting. He found me, looking like a beggar, and drove me to a small neutral restaurant. Marco was already there, flanked by two of his gorillas. He had gained weight. He wore an expensive suit that fit him badly. He looked like a parody of me. He laughed when he saw me. Lorenzo, he said, the name an insult. I heard you'd fallen on hard times. What do you want? A handout? I didn't answer. I just sat down. I let him talk. He bragged about his new position, the new deals he was making, how he was modernizing the family. It was all bluster, the insecure ramblings of a man playing a role he didn't understand. He was a king in a cardboard crown, and he didn't even know it. Finally, he ran out of steam and looked at me, a sneer on his face. So? What is it? The old lion has no roar left? I took a sip of water. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no anger, only a profound pity. I heard about Zero Syndicate, I said, my voice quiet, calm. I heard they were all arrested. Marco shrugged. Trash taking out the trash. What's it to you? And that was the reveal. Not a dramatic speech, but a simple statement of fact. The person who took them down, I said, leaning forward slightly, works for me. The confusion on his face was a thing of beauty. It was the look of a man whose entire understanding of the world has just been short-circuited. He looked at me, the old man in the worn-out coat, and tried to process the impossible. What are you talking about? Some old goon from your crew? No, I said. I thought of Alessia, her fierce intelligence, her quiet strength. I thought of how she had systematically reclaimed my dignity, not with a gun, but with her mind. The power dynamic in that room shifted not with a bang, but with a quiet, irreversible tilt. Marco's swagger evaporated, replaced by a dawning, fearful uncertainty. He was looking at me, but he was seeing a ghost, a specter of a power he could not comprehend. He didn't understand what had happened, but he understood one thing. The old man he had dismissed and laughed at was somehow still in the game, playing by a new set of rules he had never even heard of. I didn't need to threaten him. I didn't need to reclaim my old throne. In that moment of his utter, bewildered silence, I had won. I had my respect back. I stood up. I'm finished, I said, the words tasting of freedom. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him in a state of shock, a hollow man in a tailored suit. I didn't look back. The resolution was not a return to glory. It was a quiet, deliberate letting go. I told Alessia to stop the recovery of my old fortune. I didn't want it. That money was part of a life I no longer wished to lead. It was a weight, a chain that had kept me tied to a golden throne for 40 years. Instead, I had her secure a small fraction of it, enough to ensure she would never have to deliver a pizza again, enough for her to build her own future on her own terms. For myself, I kept very little, enough to buy a small house in a quiet town far from the city, a place with a garden. Sal, my last true friend, retired and moved nearby. Our days are quiet. We play cards, we drink coffee, we talk about the old days, not with longing, but with the detached wisdom of survivors. My life is small now, and I have never felt larger. The peace I have found is more valuable than any empire. It is a peace born of self-acceptance, of understanding that my worth was never in my name or my bank accounts, but in my ability to endure, to learn, and to change. I established a new boundary, not around a territory of city blocks, but around my own soul. I found validation not in the fear of my enemies, but in the quiet, respectful friendship of a young woman who saw me at my lowest and did not turn away. Alessia and I still talk. She is a legend in her world now, a ghost who hunts other ghosts. She runs her own cybersecurity firm, one of the most respected in the world, operating under a corporate name that makes me smile, Kestrel Solutions. She is building her own legacy, not of fear, but of protection. She is a new kind of power, a better kind. She is my chosen family. I am no longer Lorenzo Costello, the Lion of Midtown. That man is a story, a memory. I am just Lorenzo, a man who tends his roses. The thorns on their stems are a reminder that beautiful things must have boundaries, that they must protect themselves. I did not get the reconciliation with my old family that some stories promise. I did not want it. I chose peace instead. I chose to prune the dead branches of my life so that something new could grow. And in this quiet, sun-drenched garden, something has my own self-respect. You who are listening to my story, you may see a world of power and influence, of wealth and fear. And you may think that is the only world that matters. You may believe that strength is loud and brutal, that respect must be taken by force. But I am here to tell you, from the far side of a fallen empire, that you are wrong. True power is not the ability to command others, but the quiet, unshakable command of yourself. True strength is not in refusing to fall, but in the grace with which you learn to stand up again, often with the help of the most unexpected of hands. Look for the quiet ones, the people who are overlooked and dismissed. Look for the pizza girls of the world. They are the ones who are writing the new code, who understand the new rules. They are the architects of the future. Do not make the mistake I made. Do not become a relic in your own life. Learn to listen. Learn to adapt. And learn above all that sometimes the greatest act of power is to simply let go, to walk away from the throne, and to find your own garden to tend. It is there, in the quiet earth, that true peace is found.